My name is Hannah. I'm a graduate student with the Department of Surgery, studying tissue engineered heart valves.
Very cool.
I'm hoping to learn what physicians can do outside of being a physician.
Perfect. You're in the right place.
I'm Saloni. I'm also a graduate student in the Department of Surgery. I'm studying islet cell transplantation.
Very cool.
For me, I was interested in this course because I was interested to see how our world simplifies and gets more complex at the same time.
Very, very cool. So we have Cole, Hannah, and Saloni.
Saloni.
Yeah. Perfect.
My name is Emily. I'm in my third year of immunology. I've taken this class before in the fall of last semester, but I'm back because it's really interesting.
Great, fine. Perfect. And your name again was?
Emily.
Emily. Perfect.
So I'm Pooja. I'm a fellow under Dr. Solis. I'm from Nepal. I'm doing my renal and transplantation pathology. So since Dr. Solis introduced you to us, since he told us that you're giving a lecture, it really interested me because since you're a female and then a physician and then you thought of going to space and all, it really fascinated me. So I was interested.
Perfect. Welcome.
Yeah.
My name is Rebecca, and I'm in my first year of medicine. Previously, I worked as an oil field engineer for about 8 years, and I'm interested in this course because I think the world's moving really fast, and I want to be a part of it, so here I am.
Welcome.
Thanks.
In the back.
Hi, I'm Bigan. I'm an orthopedic surgeon from Nepal, and currently I'm doing fellowship in spine surgery at the University of Alberta. And my wife Pooja is a fellow under Dr. Solis, and then that's how I came to know about artificial intelligence and singularity. And in last class he mentioned about your lecture, and I thought I can learn something from this lecture so that I can take back home so that we can implement something in our part of the world in terms of medicine.
Fantastic. Yeah, happy to chat more later.
Yeah, thanks.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'm Gary Goldsand. I'm a clinical ethicist interested in questions of what are we going to do.
Perfect. So I'll try to leave, knowing that in mind, I'll try to leave some time for discussion because I'm sure we can get some very excellent ethical discussions. Okay, so Cole, Hannah, Saloni, Emily, Pooja, Rebecca,
Bigan.
Bigan,
Yeah.
Gary. Okay, I will try to remember that, but I will almost certainly be asking you for your names again. So, first question I want to start with is the first one we posed at the beginning of this lecture. What is innovation? Who here is old enough to remember what this is? Windows 95. It's interesting how far we've come along since that. Now we're at Windows 10 and beyond. The running joke when we look at the space program is that you hold in the power of your hand and your smartphone more computing power than all of NASA did when they sent the first man to the moon in 1969. We have the ability, all the ability in the world to perform calculations, designs, create, and look at cat videos in the palms of our hand. This is also the age when science fiction can be turned into reality, and there's companies like Aeromobile and Terrafugia actually working on things like moving cars. Also, we're borrowing from science fiction. We have the dawn of the hoverboard. Here is Buzz Aldrin, because who else are you going to get to test your futuristic technology than Buzz? At Autodesk, testing out the world's first hoverboard. And this is also the era of drones. So drones for food delivery, drones for fun, drones for photography, drones for medical delivery and beyond. This is also the era of absurdity, where that quote from Jurassic Park always comes to mind. You were so obsessed with whether you could, you didn't stop to think whether you should. So this is an example of smart furniture, I believe, out of Stanford University, where they created furniture that is mobile and, in this case, can detect where you want to put your feet up. It's also the era of 3D printing. So I'll turn it over to you guys. What are the known applications that you've heard of 3D printing? First of all, who here does not know what 3D printing is? Perfect. So 3D printing, additive manufacturing, using computer modeling to create three-dimensional sculptures or beyond. So what are the uses and applications of 3D printing? Anyone? Yes?
So about 3D printing, what I have known is like in my own specialty, like if you have any problem with the spine, if the spine is dysplastic, the regular implants and the prostheses that are available won't fit it. So what we do is like, we take a CT scan picture, do a CT 3D model, and then we design the shape of a prosthesis which will fit inside, and then we make a 3D kind of prosthesis and put in there.
Yeah.
So that's the implication in our specialty of 3D printing.
Absolutely. 3D printing for medicine, for surgery. I've seen it for skull implants, where for bone flaps, for heart valves, tissue engineering. What else?
Construction.
Construction, yes. There's companies out there working on 3D printing for habitat design and trying to solve the problem of how do you find a balance between having your structure build on layer by layer while not becoming so heavy that it's compressing the layers before they dry, but also not drying before you can build the next layer on top of it. So construction, medicine, in this case art. This one always makes me laugh because what the artist and the creator did in this case was model the particles of a sneeze and then turn that into a 3D structure and then in turn that into a vase, so your sneeze is now art. 3D printing for food, so you can have your face and eat it too. 3D printing for tissues. 3D printing in space. So this is a company made in space. They have now successfully deployed their 3D-dimensional printer to the ISS and have tested everything from in situ tools like wrenches to medical designs. So one of those is the VapoJet, and actually on one of our recent expeditions we took that VapoJet on an underwater mission to assemble it. And then 3D printing for turtles. So we talked about prosthetics. So this is a turtle who suffers from something called pyramidalism, so lost the top of their shell. So it was outfitted with a prosthesis, and now it's the niftiest looking turtle on the beach. And of course we talked about medicine. So this is less tissue engineering, but thinking of novel applications. So this was a construction worker, I believe, or a factory worker in China who had lost their hand in a factory accident. And so the hand seemed viable, but of course they wanted to give the nerve tissue vessels time to heal, and so they grafted the hand on to the calf to maintain the blood supply until the stump was ready for reamputation. So, sorry, I should have warned you that there were some graphic photos in this. So that's 3D printing. Materials is also, the world of materials is also constantly changing. Some of you have engineering backgrounds, tissue engineering backgrounds. What have you found in the time that you've been in your field about materials and how they've changed your practice or research? What about in surgery?
Regarding the materials, like earlier we used to use stainless steel for the implants. Now it has changed to titanium alloy and cobalt chrome, so they are more stronger. So in deformity correction, especially in pediatric spine problems, we are not using stainless steel or titanium alloy. We are going to shifting towards cobalt chrome, which is lightweight. It's quite strong. So that's what we do in terms of our.
And how long has that been in use with the cobalt chrome?
I think it's been a decade now. I think it's almost a decade.
A decade.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these are interesting points, because we're all in medicine. We always have to find ways to make things faster, lighter, better, cheaper, more durable for the patient, while looking out on the ethical side for side effect profiles. And so for those of you who may pay attention to the news from time to time, know that in recent years there was an issue with hernia and mesh implants and causing increased complication rates for patients. So it's always this balance when we're bringing a new technology into play. So switching away from 3D printing in medicine, speaking solely to materials, materials are all constantly evolving, and I really love this video because it's an example of new material application for oil spills. And essentially what the inventors did was create new technology that can mop up oil spills and is reusable and also saves the oil. So I'll just let you watch. So I hope to give, that the point of all that was to give you an idea of how problem spaces can evolve, how existing designs and existing objects in our everyday life, like bottles, can evolve. And now we're just going to focus that into medicine. So we have a pretty good medical background here. So I want to introduce you now to several models and frameworks to set the stage for how we go about thinking of interacting with medicine and problem solving in medicine. Has anyone here heard of the 5P model of healthcare? So this was an NIH model that was introduced about just over a decade ago. It's since evolved, and now you see almost 6 Ps. So it stands for predictive, personalized, precision, preventative, and participatory medicine. And now when you go looking at this model, it also includes point of care. And so these are the goals that the National Institute of Health in the States identified as markers for healthcare improvement. So how can we make medicine, for example, medication dosages, more relevant to a patient? Because if you compare, say, myself and Gary, there's a little bit of a difference in our build and our overall mass, and what might be the standard dose of amoxicillin for an ear infection. Possibly, it may turn out that it could be refined a little bit to be a bit more targeted. So that's the personalized and precision aspect. Preventative. What if we could identify subtle changes in tympanic membrane temperature through sensors, so we can identify an ear infection before it even happened, and then use that to predict, before we even needed to go to the amoxicillin, how could we intervene to deal with an ear infection? Participatory. How can we empower patients to take charge of their own health? And this is something clinicians deal with every single day. How do we get patients to care about the long-term sequelae of, eating junk food, not exercising, taking their medication stringently? And if you have an answer, I want to hear it, because I suspect you're a Nobel Prize winner.
By being in relationship with them.
By being in a relationship with them, that's fair. So everyone needs to marry a doctor is what I'm getting out of this.
Well, an idealized doctor.
An idealized doctor. Okay, perfect. I like it. And then point of care. So has anyone here come across this term before? So when we talk about point of care testing, point of care blood analyzers, point of care diagnostics, how many of you have had to wait to get in to see your doctor when you really need to see them that day, whether it's for a urinary tract infection, for something that needs antibiotics, for strep throat, only to be told you can't get in? A few of you. So what if we could increase accessibility by increasing point of care diagnostics and having cheap, precise, accurate tests available at the drugstore that let us diagnose UTIs and strep throat and other common maladies that would save you time and would save your physician time? And it's a problem that we're working on. It's a problem that doesn't have perfect solutions. For example, for strep, we do have point of care in certain pharmacies, but you have to pay $15 to $20, and there's a high false negative rate. But if you do test positive, then say at Shoppers Drug Mart, they can prescribe you amoxicillin and you don't have to go see your doctor. So that's something that's an evolution. Did anyone ever come across the Theranos scandal in Silicon Valley? Gary's nodding his head. Seleni's nodding her head. Yeah, so that was this big promise of having an instant point of care blood analyzer that could pretty much on a single chip with a single microgram of blood be able to test all of your diagnostics. But it turned out to be too good to be true. But that's essentially the gold standard toward which many labs, microfluidics engineers are trying to move towards. And if you can imagine, as we'll talk about with challenges in medicine, especially in my fourth lecture, the challenges of remote and austere environments, whether you're talking about space, whether you're talking about the Arctic in Canada, whether you're talking about a rural village in Kenya or India. So the second model that I want to introduce you as we're thinking about designing for healthcare is the definition of health. So when most of us think of health, we think about not being sick. But this definition was introduced to me when I was in my second year of medical school, and it really stuck with me because it's not just not being sick, but it's being well physically, physiologically, mentally, and unsaid, but I believe included in this is spiritually and in terms of sexual health. So how do we not just keep ourselves from being sick? How do we keep ourselves well? How do we motivate ourselves to get our 150 minutes of cardiac activity every week and enjoy it? How do we optimize our relationships with those we care about? How do we pay attention to things that really aren't dealt with in medicine, like spiritual and mental well-being beyond the clinical and pharmacological aspects of, say, mental health and anxiety and depression? The next and final model that I want to introduce you to is what we call CanMed's competencies. So for those of you who train as a clinician in Edmonton, in Canada, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons has 6 key components that they believe make a medical expert. And so that's scholar, advocate, collaborator, leader, professional, and communicator. So these are all challenges we all deal with every single day. So for example, you look at someone like Dr. House MD. Does he meet the CanMed's competencies? In some respects he does. He's very smart, he's a scholar, he's very good at what he does. Is he professional always? Probably not. Emily's shaking her head. Does he communicate well? Again, no. So when we think about how do we make our physicians better, we also need to know in what parameters we're trying to make them better. And then this is kind of my own experiences with challenges and trends in medicine. So, and antibiotics, scarily, were sometimes just a step ahead of the next resistance curve. Even big gun antibiotics that I was taught were, the machine gun of antibiotics in medical school, like Pip-Taz, are now meeting with resistance. There's what we call guerrilla antibiotics like meropenem, imipenem, that, even those have, they have restricted use cases, but even those are being met with resistance. There's something called sock puppeting, which is a fancy way of saying repurposing drugs. So I came across this at one of the exponential medicine conferences a few years ago, and what they basically discovered is that drugs used for one purpose, like hypertension, actually have a similarity to receptors responsible for totally non-comparable pathologies. So for example, non-small cell lung cancer. What they found was the receptors, the 3D model of that was very similar to other drugs like antihypertensives. And so they thought, what if we could, just as we repurpose a sock to become a sock puppet for totally new use, what if we repurpose a drug that's been used for one purpose to deal with a completely new pathology, which was a very revolutionary way of approaching pathologies in medicine. So Stanford now has a 3D modeling drug bank where they're working to model their 3D, the drugs, 3D receptors, and then looking at hypothesizing how this drug, which was not previously used for this pathology, might interact. We talked a little bit about patient context and personalization. New technologies, that's very broad, but we're going to go into that a little bit more. We talked about accessibility. I'm going to spend a lot of my 4th lecture talking about that. And then just coming back to pharmacology. For those who've spent any time in the States, affordability, accessibility, access to good insulin for type 1 diabetics is really a shame what type 1 diabetics and even type 2 diabetics have to go through in the States to be able to afford it, compared to Canada, where we have universal health care and basic drug coverage. So that's, these are all problems waiting to be solved. Even drugs that have been around forever, how do we make them better? How do we decrease the side effect profile? Who here has known anyone who's ever had to take a cholesterol pill, a statin? Who here has heard of anyone complain about the side effects, like their muscles are melting, they're just so tired all the time? I see some nods. I definitely have had this argument with patients and my own family, and it's sort of like, it's so good for you, but you can't convince someone to take a medication if they feel like they're having the flu and they've run a marathon all the time. And so that's kind of where the twin, the other side of that coin, selectivity, honing our drugs so that they're more precise, comes in. So taking a case study, I just want to tell you about teixobactin. So we kind of talked about drugs and drug categories and big name drugs. So the WHO stance, and quote, is antibiotic resistance is happening right now in every region of the world and has the potential to affect anyone at any age, anywhere, and is now a major threat to public health. Since the 1950s, bacterial resistance to drugs has increased tremendously, and the statistics are that 50% of antibiotics are inappropriately prescribed. And so we've talked about needing to go to increasingly big gun and more expensive antibiotics that aren't always working. And so we've had our classes of drugs. We've had things like fluoroquinolones and penicillins and other drug categories that have been around for 50, 60, 70 years now. And in 2015, the first breakthrough of a completely new drug category called teixobactin was made. And so the way they cultivated this drug, and the reason it hadn't been discovered before, is it required cultivating a soil sample and then being able to extract the properties from the fungus that grew in the soil, and which wasn't through lab methodologies that weren't previously available. So even if we have an awareness of the way things were always done, the take-home point is that even old technologies, old methods, as our methodologies progress, have the potential to advance as well. And of course, we can't talk about crises and opportunities without talking about what's going on in the world around us in 2020, coronavirus. So there's been an outbreak in China, and a previously known virus has now been known to cause extremely lethal and potent pneumonias. And today you might have, for those of you following the news, the first doctor to describe and sound the whistle on coronavirus has succumbed to the disease. And there's global outbreak, starting with China mainland. I was supposed to go to China at the end of this month and had to cancel that trip. Even the airlines are canceling their trips to the mainland. And so novel coronavirus, respiratory infection, pneumonia, is a crisis. Remission to those of us who've been around for SARS, avian flu virus, H1N1, swine virus. It's a potential pandemic. It probably already is classifiable as a pandemic, but it's also an opportunity to see how we can do infection control better, pandemic control better, and also do critical care better. So we already talked a little bit about this drug repositioning and soft opening, so I won't go over this again, but here's the source. You'll have access to these slides later for those who want to read more about data banks and 3D modeling and drugs. So we talked about 3D printing and how that can be used in patient care, and how it adds the advantage of being personalized rather than taking an out-of-the-pocket bone graft, which you would still have to hammer down in mid-surgery and fit in as a graft between the vertebral bodies. But there's also other aspects. So who here's ever broken a bone and had to wear a cast? How comfortable was it? Not very. So 2 thumbs down. What was wrong with it?
Well, for me, it just didn't fit my foot right.
It didn't fit. Was it itchy? Was it hot?
It was really hot.
Really hot, yeah. And so what you're describing is probably about 100% of the feedback on standard fiberglass casts. And so all it took is, one group saying, what if we could make casts better? And so this is an example of a 3D printed cast that's modeled to your anatomy. So when you talk about fit, you probably noticed that it was pushing on the bony parts of your foot. So if it's 3D printed to be modeled to you, there's a comfort aspect. And then you'll notice that this is a brace that you can take out and simply wash in the dishwasher and then put on your spare cast in the meantime. So you're also avoiding the smell, you're avoiding the heat. You can go swimming with it. And then you can notice here that the designers of this one added ultrasonic probes, which their early research showed that by using ultrasonic waves, they could help with, and micro vibrations, they could help with healing by up to 30% in terms of time. So genomics. This has kind of been a holy grail that people have been trying to, researchers have been trying to use for clinical, to do clinical medicine better. So here's an example out of Harvard where they tried to take the vast amounts of data that is available in the human genome and condense it into one page for primary care practitioners to have that one pager for things that are actually applicable. So how is this patient likely to respond to warfarin, a blood thinner? Will they need more, less, or the same amount than the average human being? Translating vast amounts of data into ways that are simply digestible and applicable to clinical practice. That's one of the new challenges on the horizons of medicine. And of course, AIs. So, AIs are really well represented in science fiction, from HAL 9000 to TARS and Interstellar. But it's also becoming reality. So Watson is the IBM AI, famously on Jeopardy, and did very well on Jeopardy, but also lost out to in Final Jeopardy by once saying, "What is Toronto?" to a question, something like, "What is the capital of Canada?" or something like that. But AI and machine learning is being used increasingly for diagnostics in medicine. And on that note, that's a couple slides from now. On that note, some of the challenges if we're talking about ethics in medicine is how and to what degree do we let our autonomy as clinicians slip to an AI? How much can we trust it? If an AI screws up and misses something critical like an early cancer diagnosis, who's responsible? On the other hand, knowing how remote some of our Arctic communities in Canada can be, and knowing how limited their access to medical care is. I've worked up north a little bit, and to even send a patient for blood work, you have to coordinate the transport to the lab. You have to request the medications from out of town. Is it more or less unethical to provide an AI that's not perfect, but also can provide more resources? So these are some of the questions that come along with this kind of, with new technologies. And then finally, coming back to patient context and lifestyle, it's just that life happens, and we're learning more about how the everyday of life impacts our health. So for example, here's a study, I think this was out of Duke University, that looked at the association between divorce and risks for heart attacks, and ultimately found that people who were divorced, especially women, were more at risk for heart attacks if they got divorced, even if they were remarried. So how do we mitigate that going forward? And then how do we take in completely novel things that we may, in novel uses, and apply them to medicine? So this is exactly what it looks like. This is a pigeon trying to diagnose breast cancer in a pathology slide. And what they found in the study, so they would train the pigeons to recognize cancer versus not cancer, and reward them with birdseed, and found that the pigeons were more accurate than pathologists, sorry Kim, and had a 90% accuracy rate. And so what is it though? What is it about pigeons? I mean, is it practical? Is it sanitary? Probably not. But what is it about pigeons that can recognize it? So birds actually can view in the UV range. I have parakeets, and they are capable of viewing UV light. So is that a component? Can they see things that we can't? So does it make sense to apply a UV filter when looking at pathology slides? And can that change our pathology practices? So different methods of thinking come from all over in medicine. So kind of to sum up what we've talked about before moving to the next section. So we talked about 3D printing. Here's some other, just to name off some technologies in case you're wondering what else is on the horizon of medicine. So big data, taking large data sets and then applying machine learning and AIs to look at trends that would take a human, that isn't possible to process with a single with a human, using smartphone apps for health. So for example, using apps like MyFitnessPal to help our patients track their calories, their intake, their activity to achieve their goal weight. Looking at principles in medicine, so we talked about why cobalt, titanium is better for patients, so faster, better, cheaper, smaller, lighter. We didn't really talk about nanomedicine, but one of the neatest lectures I saw was at a DARPA lecture that, they ask, why not? And they say, what if you could put mechanical respirocytes in your bloodstream so that you didn't have to worry about your hemoglobin delivering oxygen to your tissues, and suddenly you're able to hold your breath underwater for hours because you had that oxygen delivery system. And then VR and AR is the last thing we're going to talk about. So 2 case studies. So I want to tell you about Luxonic and Leap Biosystems. These are 2 Canadian companies. Full disclosure, I'm a PhD with Luxonic of immersive medicine. But basically what Luxonic is doing, they're based in Saskatoon. They're taking Oculus and making radiology and radiological imaging available to anyone in a remote center, even if they don't have the capacity, if they don't have a radiology in-house. So say I was in the remote Arctic and I had the ability to scan a patient, but I didn't know how to read the image. I could hop on the VR suite and then consult a radiologist in a major center and then review the imaging and the recommendations going forward. So this was an underwater mission we actually did in October. We were underwater in a habitat for 5 days, and we brought the Luxonic suite with us. And we successfully connected with the head radiologist at U of S Hospital and simulated an injury where a patient had shattered their scapula, and then we kind of went over the imaging together and then decided next steps. So that's one example of innovation that has potential for both space with an austere environment, and also centers that don't have your typical tertiary center hospital. And then Elite Biosystems is a brand new Canadian company that was formed. It has a very cool origin story. So a bunch of doctors made the top 72 in the last Canadian astronaut selection, and they got to talking about, hey, what if we had this for space? What if we had this for the remote Arctic? And then said, okay, well, we should have that, and decided to put together a company based around just-in-time training with AR, so artificial reality, augmented reality, and VR, virtual reality guidance for those situations. So these things that sound futuristic, but they're happening today. All right, so moving on. That brings us to opportunities and problem spaces in the last half an hour here. Any questions before we go forward? Anyone? Okay. So we're going to step outside of medicine and look at the world as it exists today. So things aren't perfect. We have, based on the global instability that's been happening over the 10 years with strife in the Middle East, Northern Africa, Afghanistan. There are more than 50 million refugees worldwide currently, and that's more than at any time in human history and greater than the greatest number since the Second World War. Despite this being a considerably more free society than at any time in human history, there's 20 to 30 million people still enslaved in the present, and that's more than any time in human history. In terms of exploration, we have so much capabilities in terms of geospatial mapping, Earth observation, but we're still fairly confined to this planet. We've had 12 men walk the surface of the moon since 1972, but no one's been back since, and that's changing. NASA has announced plans to put the first woman on the moon with the Artemis program by 2024. But these are new goalposts, benchmarks we need to set for ourselves. And one fact that always blows my mind is that we've imaged more of the surface of the moon than we have the bottoms of our oceans. To date, only 5% of our oceans have been mapped. To date, more people have been on the moon than to the bottom of the ocean. Only 4 people have been to the Marianas Trench, 11 kilometers deep, deepest part of the ocean. And then there's issues related to our very longevity and survival. So climate change is happening every year. It seems to be the hottest year on record, and has been so for the past decade. And the rate at which the world is heating is accelerating as well. to the point where the United Nations said if without extreme measures, the changes that and the harm that we're doing to the planet will be irreversible in 11 years. So if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. And then geopolitical and social problems, such as equality, gender equality, being paid enough for the same work, giving women the autonomy over their own reproductive health, or even a right to an education, or even the right to live based on what part of the world you live in. So this is kind of just a bullet point list of what's going on in the world. But the other way to look at this is to reframe and look at these as opportunities, and opportunities to make things better. And so in the last part of this lecture, we're going to talk about elements of reframing our thinking and how to go about innovating and designing and disrupting. So 4 pathways to innovation. Comes down to people, mindset, environment, and experience. So starting with people. So these are lessons learned as well as based on case studies. And so we're going to put these into practice. My next lecture is going to be all workshop based. It's going to all be you working in small groups to come up with solutions to problem spaces. So I want to, and we'll work on this in person next class, focus on knowing your own skill sets inside out, identifying your gaps, and then seeing who could help you based on their background. Because the brilliance of classes like this is you don't need to be that rocket surgeon, you don't need to be a rocket scientist and a brain surgeon. You take the bridge point between your backgrounds as a surgeon, as in tissue engineering, and ethics, and find out the cross-bridging of where your ideas can grow and build on each other's ideas. We're going to talk about teamwork, and we're going to put that into practice, building small, lean teams and how to build on ideas, and then empowering them. And now we're going to spend some time talking about mindsets. So what have you guys learned and discussed about exponential mindsets so far in this course? Have you gotten there yet? Perfect. Okay, well, we are now. So the first thing I want you to do, and in preparation, and I have a summary slide of homework assignments that I want you to pick one for next time. But I want you to start questioning everything. So taking the example that we started with, the bottle, how could this be different? How could I make it better? What else could this be used for? One of my favorite first questions to start with is, of course, how can this be better? And how can I make this better? So you identify a problem space, then identify your skill set and how you can potentially make this more novel. For example, looking even at the room around us, coffee cups. How can they be made better? What is the problem with them? They're not reusable. They contribute to a large amount of waste. They need an extra sleeve on them to prevent us from burning ourselves. How do we change that? Simple first question. This is a case study of a Canadian. She was, I want to say, 16 or 17, so this is Anya Polgarian. And basically she was volunteering in the hospital when she was a teenager, and she looked at dialysis machines, and she asked this exact question. How can this be made better? Because they're large, they're the size of refrigerators, they're bulky, they have a high energy cost to them, and for people who are in disaster areas without an energy source or in remote areas, they don't have access to the full-on dialysis machine. So she said, what if this was smaller, better, faster, cheaper? And she created a dialysis machine in a box, and it is now the size of a suitcase and a fraction of the cost. And it was simply started with that question when she was volunteering in the hospital. How can this be better? How can I make it better? The third question that when you start questioning everything is, what if? So not only how can you make this better, how can you personally make this better, but how are you going to make it better, and what if it was better? And so the case study I love is that of Ignatius Semmelweis. So those of you who are in medicine may have heard of him. He was an Austrian physician, and he noted that there was high mortality rates on obstetrical wards with women dying of puerperal fever. And he hypothesized maybe it has to do with something with the fact that physicians are going straight from the morgue to deliver babies, and maybe that's contributing. And so he introduced an idea that was so off the charts and out of the realm of possibility to even consider at the time. He was laughed off the medical ward, and that idea was simply washing one's hands. And that was considered such a crazy idea that he was actually banished to an asylum and spent the rest of his days in what was called an insane asylum at the time. So his quote is, "When I look back at the past, I can only dispel the sadness which falls upon me by gazing into that happy future when infection will be banished. Conviction that such a time must inevitably sooner or later arrive will cheer my dying hour." Today, that's one of the key things that we teach in any workplace, even in airports with the outbreak of coronavirus. Cover your mouth when you cough, wash your hands. But at the time was considered a revolutionary idea. The other take-home point about this is, and we're coming to this with environment. We'll get to that point, is sometimes you can have an innovation that seems like the best idea in the world, but the market, the environment, just isn't ready for it. So for example, how many innovations failed because of the 2008 stock market crash? Video phones have been, in theory, in existence since the 70s. Why is FaceTime only now becoming a thing? It has to do with ubiquity, has to do with cost, has to do with adoption, and how ready people are to adopt. So the other thing I want to say about mindset is learning to anticipate and getting to that mindset of anticipatory thinking instead of reactive thinking. So when I say reactive thinking, it's like when you're going through your day and something happens and then you come up with your game plan of how you're going to react to that. When we talk about learning to anticipate, we talk about thinking ahead of the curve. So in aviation we say flying ahead of the aircraft. And so this is the precursor to exponential thinking. So speaking specifically to exponential thinking, let's start with a thought experiment. Say you're on a treadmill. So if you're increasing the speed and increasing the rate at which you're running on a treadmill in an arithmetic sequence, you're increasing at 1 kilometer an hour, then you're doing 2 kilometers an hour, then 3, and that's, it sounds fairly innocuous, it sounds doable. Now say you're increasing in a geometric fashion or exponentially. So suddenly you're running at 1 kilometer an hour. Now you're running at 2 kilometers an hour. Okay, this is still doable. 4 kilometers an hour, not bad. 8 kilometers an hour. Okay, now you're breaking a sweat. 16. Now you're trying to stay on the treadmill. 32. You're turning to part Jaguar. 64. You've fallen off the treadmill. So that's how geometric sequences progress. And so when we talk about how exponential technologies progress, when we look at Moore's law and when we look at how technology increases, when we look at the rate at which technologies and communication technologies, for example, become ubiquitous. Taking another case study. When we look at the radio and the time it took to reach 50 million people, it took 38 years. When we look at the time it took Facebook and social media to reach 50 million people, it took 2 years. When we look at Taylor Swift's second last video, it took 12 days, and I don't think her last video was 1 day. So that's how things change. That's what we mean when we talk about exponential change, exponentially faster. And so when we look at how long it took to go from the radio to the television to the internet to the smartphone, what's next? Brain chips in our heads. So the next thing I want to talk about is using that anticipatory thinking and exponential thinking in terms of disruption and practical application. So once upon a time, for those of us who are old enough, to get a book, you went to a library or a bookstore. And then suddenly the big box bookstores came around and they were put out of business by Barnes & Noble and Chapters and Indigo. Then Amazon said, hey, what if we just had one major repository, and suddenly the big box bookstores were put out of business by Amazon. And then Amazon said, okay, but who's going to disrupt us? And they became their own disruptive force when they said, okay, why do we need a bookstore and physical books at all? And disrupted themselves with the Kindle. The next case study I want to talk to you about in terms of disruptive forces. Does anyone know the word blockbuster? Does that mean anything to anyone? Some of you. Excellent.
I have a
No.
membership card.
There's still blockbusters in existence, I believe. So when I was a kid, on Friday nights, we'd go down to Rogers Video or Blockbuster and we would rent a VHS tape and later DVD. And then Netflix said, well, what if you didn't have to leave your house? What if you could just order it by mail and then return it? And then they pulled an Amazon. They said, what's the next thing to put us out of business? What if you never even had to physically have something to view a movie? What if you could just stream it? And that Netflix was born in its present state. So on the opposite side of that, when we're talking about the world around us, what about the thought experiment of what it's like to live without any of our modern technologies? So this is an actual article. This is a few years old now, but what happened was they were noticing their 4-year-old and their 2-year-old were addicted to their tablets. And they didn't like the way their children were growing up. So they said, okay, we were both born in 1981 and 82. That's how we're going to live. So from then on, if they were going on a road trip, they would only use analog maps. They would not use anything with technology beyond that year, so they were stuck in a fax machine, no email. They had basic TV and an Atari system. And if they wanted to look at photos of a newborn niece, they would refuse to look at it on their family member's phone. They would insist they printed out a hard copy to look at it. So it's an interesting thought experiment because what would our life be without that convenience? And what is still missing? So the next 3 slides are due to get your brain juices thinking. So the first question I want to ask you is, what are jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago? Just shout them out. What about social media managers and social media experts? Who remembers thinking cynically about that and saying, okay, that's not a thing, that's going to be out of business in 5 years. And now, there's entire, conferences dedicated to social media, search engine optimization. Any other ideas?
Website building.
Website building, user experience, user interface design. Anything else? Anyone?
App developer?
App developers, yeah. So, got number 1 on the list. Data miners, big data analysts. One of my favorite, which I still don't believe is a thing, millennial generational expert. Zumba instructors. This graph here is amazing. It looks at the growth in Zumba instructors. I believe it's from the States over 5 years. 396-fold growth. Cloud computing service providers, digital marketing managers, sustainability managers. It used to be that we would just think about the business, but we wouldn't think about how it would be impacting the community, whether it's packaging, whether it's the impact of the building and the energy it uses. But now, corporate sustainability is very much a best practice in the business world today. So jobs that won't exist in 10 years, while we're talking about future thinking and anticipating the future. Fax machine repairman?
Pathologist.
Poor Kim's getting all the kidney shots today. He'll be replaced by a pigeon.
Concierge.
Concierge, yeah. What do you think might replace it?
Google.
Google. So when you say concierge, you mean like a personal manager?
Yeah, hotel concierge.
Hotel concierge, okay. And how might Google replace it?
By doing what they're already doing. If I want to get food, Google, ask Google that. They'll tell you exactly where you want to get food because they know everything about you.
Yeah, or even getting to that anticipatory thinking, saying, hey Cole, it's been 6 hours since you've last eaten. I noticed that you like, to order from Grubhub. I have ordered this and it's on its way. A little bit big brother there, but maybe that's what's going to happen. Any other ideas for jobs that won't exist in 10 years?
Cashiers?
Cashiers, yes. That's exactly it. We already have self-checkout. A lot of these jobs are going towards automation. Some things we won't miss, telemarketers, but are being replaced by automated robots. Freight and stock with Amazon drone delivery. Newspaper delivery. Paper copies of kind of gone the way of the dinosaur, and we're now resorting to digital news. Travel agents have been replaced by Travelocity, Kayak. and other apps. Postal workers, again, there's that drone delivery. Taxi dispatchers are being competing with Uber and Lyft. Anyone who's ever had to dictate knows that there's things like Dragon for dictation instead of having to resort to a transcriptionist. Librarians, although very useful, have to compete with online search. So when we look at the previous list then, how are these jobs going to be threatened? What's going to happen to the social media manager in 10, 15 years' time? So the last question I want to ask you is, what are jobs that don't quite exist yet that will exist in 10 years? Looking at current trends and technologies and data mining, 3D printing, ethics in medicine, given the new technologies. Any ideas? So here's my list. So when we talk about, this is something I once heard Vince Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet and an evangelist at Google, talk about bit rot. So when we are 1,000 years in the future and we're on PowerPoint 3000, how are we going to access our PowerPoint from 1998? That's what we mean by bit rot. Waste data managers. And on the flip side, what do we do with all that junk data that comes with the useful data, whether we're mining big data sets or we're looking at the human genome and looking at that 98% of data that so far is viewed as junk DNA. One thing that I think will be the healthcare system needs to see going forward is a healthcare navigator. And this is based on my own personal experiences of having family members in the hospital with very, very complex comorbidities. So, I have had aunts and uncles with Parkinson's, they have a fall, they fracture a hip, then they get urosepsis, they need to go to surgery, but they're also sick, and then I'm the one translating based on my experience as a clinician for my family. Okay, the next step is to see what their white count is, seeing that they're getting better from the infection, seeing what their urine output is, then seeing are they eating well, then seeing what their rehab is like, and then seeing finally are they ready to go home, and if they can't go home, where do they go next? But that's based on years of being a physician. So what about having a job to help someone navigate the complexities of healthcare and all the services that need to talk to each other, from the hospitalist, the physician, the occupational therapist, the nutritionist, and having someone be that mortar between the bricks? Something I'd like to see. An augmented reality architect. So as we talk about how virtual reality and augmented reality and artificial reality come into our world, how do we merge different versions of reality? And then what can we architect on that? What is the potential of that for medicine, for education? 3D printing engineers, privacy managers. Privacy's changed a little bit from when we were growing up. And if anyone has seen their children's babies on Facebook, those babies are born in the public domain pretty much. And their baby pictures are on a view for all to see. And they aren't really given a choice in that matter. And maybe it happens that they turn 18 and decide that they don't want that. So then who do they go to? Do they go to their privacy manager broker and say, help me erase my digital footprint? The aging population with healthcare, what it is, the average lifespan is, I believe, 87 in Canada. And by I think the next 20 years, at least 25% of our population will be over 65. So how do we manage that in terms of cost, in terms of living facilities, in terms of helping people age healthily, having healthy 80-year-olds. And then really getting out there, memory augmentation specialists, extinction revivalists, making Jurassic Park a reality. Second generation astronauts. So the first generation of astronauts are there to explore, to put those first steps on the moon. But once we get there, what do we do there? Do we mine? Do we create sports arenas? Do we create entertainment facilities? What will those second generation astronauts do?
Golf course.
Golf course, golfing on the moon. Love it. All right. So environment. So when we talk about building innovation mindset, we also need to build an environment that is conducive to that catalyzes that. So that comes a little bit from mindset, from work actively reaching out to people in other disciplines and asking them what their problem and pain points are. So that's a little bit of mindset, but it also takes a little bit of physical engineering. oops, to do that. So this is the physical layout of Pixar. You can see it's a very open space. I think it's Pixar as well, that it's kind of a round circle, and that to get to the restroom, the space is engineered so you have to walk across the facility, and you're designed to bump into people from other departments. And that's how some of their greatest ideas have been born. So engineering your workspace, so you have to talk to others and brainstorm. Same with Google, open floor plan. It's an idea and it's an experiment, and this was kind of a product of the last decade. And now there's new research showing that maybe it's not the best thing for productivity, and maybe there's a balance. But that's something to keep in mind, and definitely next workshop, we're going to be engineering you guys into groups, so you have to collaborate, so pretend to be surprised. And then looking at the platform and the diaspora of tools that exist for us to empower ourselves today. So this is one of the best times to be an innovator, an inventor, and to empower yourself. There is a whole plethora of resources out there to teach yourself, to broadcast yourself, to fund yourself, to invent. So on the funding side, there's Kickstarter and CrowdSpring. On the education side, there's massive online open courses like MOOCs, Coursera, MIT, edX, Khan Academy. There's ways to become a tinkerer even if you're not an engineer with little breadboards like Raspberry Pi and Arduino boards, Makey. I think I have a video on the next slide. And then to broadcast yourself, YouTube and SoundCloud. Oh, maybe I took up a video. And finally, coming down to the fourth aspect of the innovation pathway is experience. So this was a really interesting study. They took 5 major names in innovation who've done big things in the computing world and the business world. So they took Michael Dell, Pierre Omidyar, Michael, can't read that name there. So they took 4 major innovators, and they looked at their personality traits in terms of associating, questioning, observing, experimenting, and networking. And then they compared that to non-innovators, and you can see that this black line compared to the general population, all 4 of these people were above average when it came to these traits. And so it's not something, my hypothesis is that these traits associated with innovation aren't something that you're born with, they're not innate, but they can be cultivated. And this, what I'm trying to do is pave the seeds for the next class on starting to build these traits. So we talked a little bit about questioning, about asking what if and how you can make it better. We talked about observing and looking for things to be made better, whether it's a bottle or a coffee cup. And then experimenting, designing prototypes around that. Team building, networking, and associating, putting things together that wouldn't normally necessarily be together in terms of disciplines. So here it is in practice. We talked about the really young and the really old, and having people who we would not normally expect to be designers. So this is an article on a 91-year-old designer employed by IDEA, which is a design firm, and they wanted her help based on her experience in the group home, saying, what are your pain points? And she noticed that her and her friends with their arthritic hands couldn't open these child-proof bottles to access their pills. And so then they used her expertise to redesign the pill bottle in a way that was safe but user-friendly for someone with arthritic hands. And so then this is the ideal modeling pathway, is sketch your innovation, prototype it, present it, validate it, and then reiterate. This is a friend of mine, his name is Aryan Mishra, and he also employed that innovation mindset. And when he was 14, he asked, what if? He took on an astronomy project. And he said, what if I could do something really big for astronomy? And he discovered an asteroid when he was 14. And now he's taking that love of astronomy at the age of 19 and creating astronomy camps for kids all across India. So what we're going to do in the next class, and what we're going to do in the days leading up to the next class, is try to cultivate this innovation mindset. And I want you to start questioning. I want you to start observing what can be done better. And I want you to even go through thought experiments of how things can be made better, and jot notes about what you would do to make this thing better. So we talked about the 4 principles and pathways of fostering innovation: people, mindset, environment, and experience. So we talked about a very novel future in which kids on their days off from school can be curing cancer in the form of a video game, the Terminator. This is kind of a snapshot of what the future could be. Maybe we'll have encyclopedias, we'll have a Wikipedia in our hand that's also an augmented reality, and if I want to know anything, I can just put my AR app over the world and suddenly get the Wikipedia experience and know anything about any object at any time. Maybe we can have 3D imaging and brain scanners that can give us instantaneous medical information. Maybe we'll have autonomous vehicles that will let us sleep or work out on the way to work, and we're already on our way there. And maybe we'll have second generation astronauts that create new cities, new sports in a lower gravity environment off-world. But if we want to create the future, it's up to every one of you guys. So, to start getting into this alternate thinking mindset, here are some questions and here are some assignments for you. So I want you to just pick one of these and we can kind of discuss them at the beginning of next class. Design your own Terminator scenario. In the year 2027, what is your science fiction scenario for medicine or for the world that seems really far-fetched today that you would like to see? Pick a sector within your own field, whether it's education, transport, space, medicine, and then develop that future scenario for it. What would you like to see happen in transport? Do you want flying cars like in the Jetsons or the Fifth Element? Do you want to see us, having autonomous vehicles? What about autonomous flying cars? Take a pen and a notepad, and as you wander through campus, write down things that could be made better, and then write down how you would make it better, and then what you want to happen to make it better. Or even just pick a technology to learn about. We've covered a lot here today, but there's a whole lot more that we haven't even scratched the surface of. So here's some questions to get you started. We talked about how could this be better? How can we make this better? Who can help you? What skill set do you need that you don't have to make this better? What would be the ideal use case for this problem that you've identified? For a problem space or an industry, what would disrupt this? For medicine, it would be putting ourselves out of business and never having to go see the doctor in the first place. What is the future of Sector X, whether it's social media, whether it's privacy, whether it's smartphones, or even just have discussions. So it's very broad, but I just want you to start planting the seeds to get yourself into that headspace of how do I think differently, how do I innovate, how do I build, and then we're going to have a very condensed workshop looking at these principles next time. So be prepared, come ready to collaborate. That's about all I got. We have 1 minute left for questions.
So if I could add one thing, I'm also interested in active resistance to innovation. And you might say, oh, it's just corporate greed. But no, there are many other things, even words like atlas. If you're associated with one particular kind of atlas, and there's a proposed presentation at a meeting using the word atlas, but that has nothing to do with the kind of atlas that you've been part of, you may resist that appearing on the program because it seems threatening to your area of science. And probably all sorts of other things that I haven't thought about. So what we've done at meetings is say, well, we have predicted the future of this area, and it's these phrases and terms, Why are no presentations at the meeting at all containing any of these words and phrases? Then you go to the exhibit area, look at the largest exhibit, go there and say, who is the thought leader here? And ask them that question, and uniformly you'll get the answer. It may seem odd, but there are always people opposed to progress because progress is not in their interest. But also think about that. What if we could find the cure for these things that are resisting, pushing back, barriers to kind of new kinds of presentations at meeting? You would think there would be no barriers. The more innovative, the better, and every program committee would feel that way. But that's not the way the world works, So that's also interesting. to me. And it's been proposed that I write a paper on it, so I'm trying to figure out what are all the use cases there? What are all the reasons that new subjects are resisted at a meeting? Just like the guy who, Semmelweis and his idea of washing hands.
And how do we resist responsibly? Because
Yeah.
I have become a resistor when it comes to nutrition, because every year, what I tell my patients when they ask me about diet is, wait 2 years and the pendulum will swing, because
Right.
even since I've gotten into medicine, it's been
Sure.
Atkins, self-page, keto, paleo,
Yeah, they're
paleo-keto.
fads, yeah.
And basically the evidence says, as long as you can pick a diet and stick to it, you can lose weight. So it's, how do we get people to stick to their diets?
Right.
I think what might explain the dynamic you're describing is the human fear of the unknown,
Yes.
which we could look at history and say people fear the unknown. That seems to be pretty reliable. So I think there will always be that tension. But I think it does set up the challenge, which is that we should be able to respect the traditions and the things we love about the past and simultaneously innovate without thinking that those things are fundamentally threatened.
Right.
It's the fear of that I think drives the resistors.
Yeah, and the whole thing about not sticking up and being different from other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many societies, I mean, that's bad. You're supposed to conform, right? So is it possible to innovate and conform at the same time? Well, maybe, but really the two are kind of opposing, right? So, sure, there can be ways in which sticking out, making a inappropriate display of yourself is obviously wrong, but also conforming can really hold things back if the society very much feels that people have to sort of act in a certain narrow range of behavior. So anyway, at the moment, this is something that interests me very much. What are the active barriers to innovation? So in your preparation for the workshop on Tuesday, I'd like you to also think about that. Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. So I'll put up my other email address when I send out the slides, but basically Shawna Pandya @gmail.com is probably the better email address to get.